Hello again and welcome. This is going to be the third video in our kind of getting nitty-gritty with programming in Python for DH. So in the first videos we talked about data, how to structure it, how to make it relational, and then in the past two videos we've looked at kind of how to do more complex things. We've looked at functions, we've looked at loops, and we've also looked at conditionals and branching. In this video, we're going to have the last thing that we really need to talk about before we can start really doing more complex things in Python, like opening text files and working with data that's outside of our Python script. In this video, we're going to be talking about classes, specifically what they are, how to use them, how to create them, and why they're kind of useful for DH in certain very specific instances. So I've got it all up here. Don't let this scare you. We're going to work through each of these steps step by step so that you, when you leave this video, will have a clear idea about how to create a class and input data into it and call it for future use. So first of all, what is a class? A great way to think of a class in your mind is something that creates, in its core level, a dictionary. So it takes a series of information and makes it relatable to one another in the form of a dictionary. And if you remember, dictionaries were nothing more than a squiggly bracket, some kind of a key set to a value. And what a class is going to do is it's going to give us a series of keys relatable to a series of values. And these can be anything that we want. And I'm going to talk about that in more depth in a second. So the first question, though, is how to create a class. In Python, it's quite simple. You simply type in the word class, and you name the class. In this case, I'm going to be working with our same data that we had in lecture 5 when we spoke about tuples. And in that lecture, I spoke about emperors, Charlemagne, Louis the Pious, and Lothar the First. In this video, we're going to stick with that exact same data. So what you want to do is you want to create a class by simply typing in class and then name it. And then you're going to name it, you're going to put a colon to delineate where the class, like the indentation for the class and what's going to be within this, the commands within this class. Let's ignore all of this stuff for right now. All of these birth dates and all of that. For right now, let's focus on this. If you remember correctly from the last video, when I spoke about functions, DEF is how you define a function. And this init is going to be our function. It's very important that in your attributes for this function in your class, that you have self be the first one. I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. But what that's going to essentially allow us to do is to create a new instance for different emperors as we go through our list. So we're going to have self, and then we're going to have a series of attributes that we want to see. So we're going to have name, birth, coron is going to be coronation, and death. And then what you're going to do is you're going to follow this very simple format, and you're going to do self.name equal to name. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to call each of these in this order as we work through and input data into classes. And a good way to use classes is when you have things like this, when you have emperors that have a series of similar or same attributes that you want to replicate, but you don't want to replicate the code. Instead, you want to reuse the code, reuse the attributes, and just feed them through this thing called a class. And again, this is going to make more sense when we start printing off the results from doing this. So if you were to just do this, close this out. If you were to just do this, you can see that I have a series of commands right here. What I have done is I've created an object, P1, and that's going to be equal to emperor, the class. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed it a series of attributes in a consistent order. It's going to be the name, which corresponds to name here. It's going to be birth, which corresponds to birth. It's going to be coronation, which corresponds to coronation, and death, which corresponds to death. Consistency is key here. When you are creating data, this is true of Python, this is true of any kind of database that you're working with, true of Excel, you need to be consistent. If you are inconsistent, the machine's not going to know that, and it's just going to be inconsistent. But not because it isn't in and of itself wrong, it's going to be doing everything correctly. You were the one who messed up. So it is important when you are creating these instances within this class that you are consistent in how you're doing it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create essentially 3 different emperors. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to feed each one of these through this class, which is going to store them in memory. So right now, when we run this script, it's not going to really do anything. Done. See, nothing happened. But what we need to do is realize that in memory, all three of these individuals have been run through our class and are now able to be called. And how we call something in the class is a little bit different. Were I to simply want to print off P1, in your mind, you might think that it'll just print off all of this information. In fact, it won't. It is going to give us this very odd looking thing right here. And that's because it's being handled differently. This data is being handled differently because it is being processed through a class, and the object that's being created is a little bit different in Pythonic terms. There are two different ways in which we can get the data that we've run through the class. The first is one that's going to be antiquated fairly soon, I imagine, in the next few updates of Python. The first way you can do it is you can take the data, that object, and return it as a dictionary, which is essentially how it's kind of being stored and looked at. And when you do that by typing in P1, so person one, dot underscore underscore dict underscore underscore, and that's going to return something that looks like that. This should look familiar to you. This is a dictionary. The key of name is Charlemagne. The key of birth has a value of 742. The key of Quran, 800, etc. down the list. There is, however, another way to do this, and this is the one that's becoming more and more Pythonic because it's becoming more and more powerful. And I'll explain the difference between these two in just a second. The other option is to use the vars function. We can print off vars, and we're going to see the exact same thing outputted. Vars is preferred because it looks a lot cleaner, it looks a lot nicer. And one of the key things about Python is producing not only quality code and efficient code, but code that is easy to read if you didn't actually write it. And vars looks a lot cleaner than P1. It is, however, still rather limiting. In order to call a specific value from these dictionaries that are being produced, we need to use .dict still. And I think in a future update of Python, probably 3.8, 3.9, it's going to actually make vars more capable and more powerful of doing things like this. So if I wanted to just print off the name, just the name from P1, I would have to run it like this. And when I do that, I see that Charlemagne is put in the output. And that's because it's going through, it's rendering P1 as a dictionary, as it should, and then it's identifying in these brackets the specific key that we want to look at, and it's returning the specific value. This is how dictionaries operate, if you remember from my lecture on dictionaries, which is lecture number 7. So that's kind of the two different ways in which you can return the data. And that's nice and useful because once you return it, then you can start manipulating it in your code however you want to. The reason why classes are more powerful is because of this great little feature that you can do in them. You can actually store specific functions in them. And what these functions allow you to do is to not repeat code later on. Let's say I wanted to do this. Comment this out for a second. Let's say I want to print off a very specific string. I want it to print off, I'm using F commands here, P1's name was born in P1 birth. Now, I can do that, I can run it, and it's going to come off Charlemagne was born in 742. I can sit here and I can do this for each one of these people. I'm just going to copy and paste because this is going to become very annoying very fast. I can sit there, I can do this for P2, I can sit there and do that for P2, and I can do that for P3 as well. Let's go ahead and do this just to show you how annoying this is. And this is with just 3 people that I'm having to do this for. If you're repeating stuff in code, you're doing something wrong in code. This is a good rule of thumb. There's a couple instances when it is necessary to repeat things, but for the most part, when you're writing code, you want to be as the least repetitive as possible. And as you can see, I've typed in 3 lines of code, and I've been able to get these 3 results, all different because I'm calling different classes manually. But I don't have to do this. Once I'm working with a class, I can simply create a new function within the class. And remember, in our last video, one of the key benefits of functions is that it allows you to work with code differently because you can replicate things with very minimal effort. So notice here, I had to specify which individual I was looking for. So I had an F command for P1, P2, and P3, corresponding to these. When we feed something through a class, we create an instance of it, and we do that by me just comment this out. We did this here when we fed an instance of P1. So what we did was we fed an instance of P1 into Emperor and had it output the dictionary. We can do something similar with functions. So what we can do is we can simply say P1, and we want to make sure I get this right. Print birth date. P1. Oh, that's my fault. Comment this out. There we go. Okay, so what we can do here is we can simply feed P1 through this. And what it's going to do is it's going to run that manually. We can do the same thing with P2 and go through and return Louis the Pious was born in the year 778. We can do the same thing with P3. So what we're able to do is we're able to actually return multiple instances of code by creating a function within our class. This might not seem that complex right now, but once again, like I've said in past videos, when you're working with lots and lots of data, this is very, very useful to do. So that's one of the ways in which you can kind of work with classes to do rather complex things. You can also do more complex things, such as here. What we're going to do that. And we're going to use, instead of birth date, we're going to be looking at prose. We can establish a very simple common prose, and it's going to return this little output up here. Lothar the First, it was emperor from 817 until his death in 845, and we see that that's happening right here. It's printing off this F command very, very quickly, very, very cleanly. And that's very handy. Another thing that we can do is we can actually have it do more complex functions. So for example, let's say we wanted to have a rather complex string. We can say p3.compare, and we want to compare it to a second item. We want to compare it to p2. And what we can do here is we can see in the output this. So what has happened here? Well, I probably should do it the other way around because this is going to look confusing. So we're going to do compare p3. Let me just repeat this real fast. There we go. So let's look at what's happening right here. I've issued a command. I've said that I want to run an instance of P2, so Emperor Louis the Pious, and compare it, use the function compare, and I want to compare it to this argument, A. And A in this case is going to be taking P3, which is this data here. And so what it's going to do is it's going to print off self.name, which is going to be in this case P2, because that's the chief instance that I'm running, died in self-death, but a.name, this is now going to be referring to Lothar, was emperor in a.corn. That's going to be the year in which he was coronated. This means that they ruled together for self-death minus a.corn. So what this is going to do, it's going to take the death of Louis the Pious and subtract that from the coronation year of Lothar, and it's going to say that they ruled together for this many years. And if you look down here, this is exactly what has happened. If I want to return a readable string of data, this is a great and easy way to do it. This is a lot easier to read than simply comparing in your mind these two pieces of data. More importantly, I could iterate across this much more quickly than I could by simply looking at it with human eyes. And that's the real power of a class, is the ability to not only contain a whole bunch of information within a single instance and store it with just one line of code, but also be able to manipulate that through functions within a class. So here in the output, we see Louis the Pious died in 840, but Lothar I was emperor in 817. This means that they ruled together for 23 years. That's the string that was outputted by me simply typing in this bit of code here. And if I want to have a different output, all I have to do is change just two small things in the code, and it outputs something a little different. It outputs that Charlemagne died in 814, but Louis the Pious was emperor in 813. This means that they ruled together for about 1 year. There you go. This is kind of the power of classes. A great way to think about a class, like I said, is this thing that can contain multiple keys and multiple values, so that you don't have to constantly create a bunch of dictionaries over and over and over again. So instead of creating a series of dictionaries, we're able to simply just feed objects through a self with very specific attributes that are then structured as a series of keys and values. So when you see all this happening, what you would have to do otherwise, if you did this as a dictionary, is you would have to type in uh, name, colon, Charlemagne, comma. I'm doing this on purpose because it's going to take forever to do by hand. Birth, colon, 742. I'm not going to go through the rest of this. You get my point. In order to actually type all that out and create individual dictionaries would take a long time to do. Instead, I can simply type in P1 equals emperor, and then I can type in Charlemagne, and then just delineate everything with commas because it's automatically going to populate that dictionary for me. You saw how much more quickly I was able to type that in. That's the point of Python, being able to create fast, consistent, and efficient code very, very quickly. So hopefully this gives you a sense of how to create a class, what classes really kind of do in Python with regards to the creation and the storage of data, and kind of some of their utility. Really, you're only going to be limited by your imagination. Different instances are going to be of a project, DH project, will require you to use different ways in which you store and manipulate your data. I have not talked about all of the power of classes in this video. I simply wanted to give you an introduction to what they were, how they functioned, and how you might use them, and how to layer functions within a class. I'm going to be coming back to this again and again and again as we get into more complex coding. For right now, play with classes, mimic my code here to kind of get a sense for how to create them and how to store data in them and how to call data in them. And try, if you can, to use that vars method, but also try the dict method so you can actually call specific keys. So that's all for right now, and I look forward to talking to you in the next video when we start talking about how to really work with data by importing it and manipulating it in text files. Thanks for listening.